All right, thank you. Hello, I'm Josh Hanley. So who here has heard of event sourcing? Most of you? Sweet. Who's used it? 3 of you-ish? So what is event sourcing? According to Martin Fowler, the fundamental idea of event sourcing is that ensuring every change to the state of an application is captured in an event object. To me, what that means is whenever something happens in our app, we capture that change of data or action in an event. So that's just the first piece. The second piece is using those events to determine what state our data is in. Now, there are a few event sourcing packages out there for PHP. Some of the popular ones are Event Source and Proof. They're both just usable for any PHP application, or there's Sparksy Laravel Event Sourcing and Verbs, which are both for Laravel specific. Today, we're going to talk about event sourcing with Verbs. Just quickly, how many of you actually use Laravel? Oh, okay, sweet. I'm not in the wrong place then. So yeah, we're going to talk about Verbs, which is a package built for Laravel. So as I said before, I'm Josh Hanley. I've been using PHP since 2007 and Laravel since about 2015. This is what I look like on the internet, where you can find me. I'm one of the core maintainers of Livewire and a top contributor to Verbs. And I work for a small Laravel agency called Thunk. So what is Verbs? Verbs is an event sourcing package built for Laravel by these guys, Chris Morell and Daniel Colborn, to make using event sourcing more accessible. But why the name Verbs? First, we need to look at what is a verb. Verbs are words that represent actions. So in the context of an application, a verb can describe an action that a user can take. Or in event sourcing, a verb describes an action a user or the system has taken. So why was Verbs built? Typically, event sourcing is wrapped up with DDD and CQRS, and all three of these concepts each have their own terminology and jargon, which can be tough to follow for newcomers. Implementations of a lot of event sourcing packages are also quite verbose in how they are written, as they are, press the wrong button. There we go. Implementations of a lot of event sourcing packages are also quite verbose in how they're written, as they're designed for large teams and distributed systems. So Verbs was built to make onboarding and implementation of event sourcing into a Laravel app a lot simpler, with simpler and more obvious naming and an easy implementation path to make event sourcing more accessible. So when should you use event sourcing? Often when you see examples of event sourcing, the examples presented are for transaction-based systems, like banking systems or shopping carts. This can make it tough to determine when exactly is the right time to implement event sourcing in an application, as it's not often that we're actually working on transaction-based systems like that. But as Verbs is a lot easier to implement and maintain for smaller projects, we believe that you can event source most things. Have a think about whether there are models in your application which would benefit from having, say, a log of all actions applied to it, or any changes to the data and who they were triggered by. Or whether there are critical pieces to your app. You know, if there was a bug in the system that was critical, that you can ascertain exactly what the user was trying to do so it can be fixed correctly. Or maybe you don't know how the data in your app should be structured yet. This is also a great candidate for event sourcing, as we can capture the events and the data as they happen. Then, as our understanding of the system evolves, we can use those existing events and data and restructure the app and rebuild the data in a new and more desirable format. We'll touch on that more a little bit later. Let's have a look at some of the main concepts in Verbs. We have events and states. Today we'll start with events. Events are the actions that your users or the system has taken in your application. Event names are typically described using verbs and are in the past tense. So some examples of event names would be user created, quote approved, invite email sent, quote rejected, item added to order, etc. So let's have a look at what a verbs event class might look like. So we see here we have just a basic PHP class called postCreated, and we're extending the Verbs event class, and it has two public properties, title and content. Yeah, pretty basic. That's the most basic form of a Verbs class, but there's a lot more that we can put into an event class. You could get away with actually firing and storing events just with this information alone. The full event class, though, would look like something like this. You can see in this example, we're actually using the constructor at the top. So you can either have public properties or you can use the constructor with public property promotion, whichever you prefer. And then there's 4 methods here: authorize, validate, apply, and handle. We'll touch on that in a minute. So once we have our event class, we then need to fire our event. The way we do that is we call post created : fire, and we pass the parameters in as named parameters, so like our title and our content. And then we call verbs commit. The difference here is what fire does is fires the event and stores it in memory, whereas commit actually stores the event to the database and then runs any sort of side effects like creating eloquent models, etc. There is also shorthand for this where we can just do post created : commit. So when and where do we fire events? We should be firing off events whenever a user or the system has taken an action. So for example, some data has been updated or an email gets sent, we need to fire an event. These will be typically fired off in controllers, jobs, or livewire components if you use livewire. So here I have an example of a Laravel post controller. We have a store method which is used for creating our post. So this is what it would normally look like. We would validate our data first. We would then create an eloquent model using post : create, and then we'd redirect to the show page. So using verbs, we would actually delete the post create call, and instead we'd fire our post created event. So how does this differ from other event sourcing packages? In other event sourcing packages, an event will typically just hold event data, and that's it. Business logic, creation of eloquent models, things like that would normally live in other classes. Whereas in verbs, it follows the ethos of co-location of code. So the code to validate your business logic lives in the event. And the code to create, say, an eloquent model also lives in the event. So you saw on the previous screen that we've removed the post model creation logic. Well, this now gets moved into our event, into a handle method. So if we go back to our post created class, we can see here we have our parameters, properties from before, title and content. We've added a handle method to this. This is where our eloquent models or any emails or anything like that you need that might happen all happen in the handle method. What we're doing here at the moment is we're taking the data from the event directly and we're passing it into the post create call to create our eloquent model. So in event sourcing, we generally have both read models and write models. So this creation of the eloquent model here, like we're doing here, is what we call a read model or a projection. Whereas, and this is different for a write model, which we're going to have a look at in a minute. So that is a brief overview of events. So now let's talk about states. So the definition of the word state is the particular condition that someone or something is in at a particular time. So in event sourcing, the state is the current state of our data, which has actually been calculated from the events that have happened. So if any of you have heard of event sourcing before, you may have heard of the term an aggregate route. What is an aggregate route? Hands up if you know what that means without looking it up. One person? Great. An aggregate route or an aggregate is where our state is held. The problem with it, though, for people new to event sourcing, is it can sound complicated. So in verbs, an aggregate is actually just called a state. So it's where the current state of our data is stored. Once we have a state with our data, we can then use that for business logic and data validation. So let's have a look at what a state class looks like. Here we have a post state and it has 3 properties: title, content, and status. And it extends the verb state class. Again, pretty simple, easy to follow. What we now need to do is we need to be able to update our state based off our events when they're fired. So the way we do that is we need to tell our event, we need to tell our event about our state first, and then we can update the event data on our state. So to provide a state to our events, we need to go back to our post-created commit or fire call. And you can see here I've added a new parameter in called state. And here what we're doing is we're actually calling the post state and we're calling new. What this is doing is actually creating a new instance of our post state. The reason we're doing this in this scenario is because we're creating a new post. We don't have a post state at the moment. There is also a load method that you could call. So if we had an existing post state, we could call post state colon load and pass the ID of the state that we're looking for in. So now this is what it looks like when we put it all together into our controller. So next step now is we need to actually apply the changes from our events to the states. So if we go back to our post created event, we can see I've added now an apply method to the bottom here, and it's taking the event data and applying them to the properties in the state. The last thing we're doing there is we're now setting status to draft. I just want to point out one quick thing though here is you can see the top property there, the post state, the state property, sorry, just type in with post state and it looks something like that. Now, this is actually a new way of adding states to events in Verbs. It's only just been introduced. If you look at the Verbs documentation at the moment, you might see this instead, using attributes. This is the old way to do it, where you'd have just the ID of the state that you're trying to reference, and you use the state ID attribute, which would actually load the state on our behalf. But that is not getting deprecated, it'll still exist, but we're going to stick with the new way of using it for now. So just wanted to explain the difference if you're looking at the Verbs documentation, why you see all these attributes and why I'm not demonstrating them tonight. So let's have a look at our post created event again, now with everything that we've got. So we've got our properties at the top, we have our apply method where we're updating our state, and then we have a handle method at the bottom, which is then creating our eloquent models. This is intentional, that's how it's structured, because this is the order that Verbs actually go through and call the methods when an event gets fired. So it's always good to keep the methods in this particular order. So how can we use states to validate our events? Just updating the values on a state isn't particularly helpful. Like we're setting title and content in apply, and then setting title and content in handle, and it's into like double handling. Instead, a state should be used as a source of truth to determine whether an event is allowed to be fired or not. It contains a business logic for our application. So to achieve this, we can use the validate method on an event. And inside that validate method, we can run assertions to make sure the state is in the correct state before we allow an event to fire. So for example, imagine we have a post published event, and our post can have three possible statuses: draft, published, and archived. But we have a business rule that archived posts cannot be published again. So we need to add some validation to our post published event to ensure that our post status is not set to archived. So we see here I've added a validate method to our post published event, and it does a check to make sure the status of the post is not equal to archived. And if it is equal to archived, Verbs will actually throw an exception called an event not valid for current state exception with that message passed in. So to look at the full event now, this is our post published event with our validate method up front, then apply, and then handle. So if the validation fails, apply and handle won't get called at all. Let's dig into states a little bit further though. We can actually use our states as states machines to encapsulate our business logic. So before we had this check in our event, is status not equal to archived? Well, we could wrap this up in a helper method and say, can be published, right? Then that helper method can be moved onto our state so we can reuse this logic. Now, in our validate method on our event, we can go back and reuse our helper method and say, assert that the state can be published. You ever imagine expanding on this, right? Applying state machine logic on our post state to enforce things like maybe drafts can only become published, but maybe once published, a post can't be turned back into a draft, and instead can only be archived. All this can be enforced by logic inside of our state as a state machine to determine if those state transitions are allowed. And then our events can make use of that logic to validate and update the state if allowed. This is why we distinguish between applying changes to a state versus creating and updating an eloquent model. This allows us to encapsulate our business logic in our states and events, and our models are just read-only data representations. So now that you've seen all this, you might be asking, why should I use event sourcing? One of the main reasons that I particularly love is for bug fixes. Have you ever had a customer ring up and say, I tried to send an email to one of my contacts, and it's sent, but the link in the email doesn't work. All of a sudden, you're now digging through your logs to determine if there was an error with the email, if that error was even captured at all. And even if it has been, sometimes you may not have all the data to see exactly what a user is trying to do. I had this one the other month with one of my clients. Their customer had tried to send a quote, and it sent. The link didn't work. Now, for some context, though, users can customize those emails before they send them from the system. Thankfully, we'd event sourced most of the app, so it's a simple matter of reviewing the quote sent event in the database to review what the details the customer had entered into the customer email field. As it turns out, the system-generated link that is inserted into the email had been removed, and the user had copied the link from their browser and pasted that into the email instead. But the links in the emails generated by the system are signed URLs, whereas the link the user provided is a URL that's only accessible when logged in. So naturally, it wasn't accessible for the person that they sent it to. We were able to quickly ascertain this. We updated the template for them with the correct link, and they're on their way, and their email sent successfully. For a demonstration of finding and fixing a production bug live on stage, I highly recommend checking out Daniel's Laracon US talk, where he finds a bug in the game where they were giving out $1,500 in cash as a prize to Laracon, and he fixed it live on stage. Another good reason for using event sourcing is for database schema changes. So event sourcing really shines when to allow us to change the structure of our database after the fact through a technique called replays. We can truncate our elephant models tables, change the structure of them, and then replay all of our events from the beginning to rebuild our models back up from the stored event. Again, in Daniel's talk that I mentioned before, he uses replays to rebuild the elephant models after the game-winning bug had been fixed. Replays can be a whole talk on their own. One thing to note, though, is it can take a little while to get used to how replaying works. So it's a good thing to explore and experiment with them. In the past, replays and other packages have been difficult to use, whereas Verbs tries to make it easier and more commonplace. So along with being able to make database schema changes, event sourcing allows you to build new features without being locked into the current structure of your database. It allows you to build features in your app as if they were greenfield features, shaping the application and the data exactly as you need it. Then you can replay your events to fit them into this new data structure. Auditing and history logs can also be another major draw card for event sourcing, as you can have a full record of every action that the user has taken, when it was taken, and what data was changed, without even having to lift a finger, as it's inherently built into the system. To make viewing a history log of a model easier, we currently have a first-party Verbs package in the works called Verbs History that allows you to quickly drop a history log into your application and display a nicely formatted log, activity loggable model to your user. Speaking of new features from earlier, who here has ever been asked to build a new dashboard that shows metrics for some business thing in some really specific way that requires you to use some really nasty SQL queries to join subquery tables until you get the data into a structure that you need? Maybe you have a YesQL database, Sam, but that structure still isn't helpful for what your users are after. What if instead you could create the ideal table for that new dashboard, which has the data in exactly the right structure? So it's just a simple SQL query to get the data and display it, say, in a chart. From using event sourcing, as mentioned earlier, this is possible by building out a new dashboard, a fixed feature, in an ideal world, a data structure, and then we can just replay our events to populate them. So to recap, we have two main concepts in Verbs. We have events and states. Events are the record of actions taken in our apps by users or the system, whereas states are the current state of something, which is calculated from stored events and used for business logic and validation. Now, there's a lot more to learn about event sourcing, but this should be enough to get started. To learn more, next week is Laracon AU, and I'll be talking about Verbs and Livewire in action, reviewing how you can effectively use Livewire and Verbs together to handle user actions by providing actions the user can take in our Livewire applications and then capturing those actions that were taken by users in Verbs events. Thank you. Any questions?
You have some probably dumb questions.
Dumb's great.
Are all events then stored in one like giant log table?
Yes.
Essentially.
Yep.
You don't end up with tens of millions of rows.
Yes,
you do.
Yes, you do.
Okay. And like email chunks that are just blobs.
Yeah. So the event table in particular can get pretty big.
I think I've made something like this before.
Yeah.
And then like 40 million rows in it.
Yeah, we've got one guy that's using Verbs. The Verbs at the moment is still pretty 1.0.
Yeah.
We're sort of hoping to get that out in the next couple of months, but not 100%. As you just saw, we're still tweaking the API a little bit, making it easier to use. We've got one guy that's actually using it in production, and he has 27 million events in his events table. And he's about to do a full replay of all of his event data. And it's something we're working with him is like, how can we improve the performance on this? And it's actually quite fascinating. But honestly, I don't know how that's going to react yet. I'll tell you in a month's time. So
you inherently only store what you care about. So if you don't care about a user changing their name, you don't store that event.
Yeah.
You just store things that you want to be able to.
Yeah. So you might, so like your event source, your quoting system or your inventory system or whatever, but
emails is the most.
Users table, maybe not. It depends on the app. You could do your users table if you really want.
You also don't need to store it in the same database like long term.
Yeah. I think that's something we'll potentially look at in the future. We're trying to get 1.0 out the door as soon as possible. But I think looking at like Sparksy's Laravel event sourcing package, for example, allows you to set up different event tables with different models. So you have an event table for your posts, an event table for your inventory, an event table for your quotes. Which that would improve the efficiencies as well. So yeah.
How do you handle different versions of events? So like, for example, we've run into this a few times, what we use event sourcing. Let's say after some period of time, a business rule comes in and say blog post, for example, you've got title, description, status, and then as of next month, we also need a fourth property. And that's required, but only for events that happened from then onwards. How do you handle, I know in like React, and they have sort of front end libraries that handle like transforming different versions of local storage objects. So how do you handle that?
Event versioning is one of the things we have left on our list.
Yeah. And archived posts can always be published in the future. Like that'll always get changed.
Yeah.
Someone will complain.
Event versioning is what we're looking at. So what you're saying is in a database, in raw data, you might have title and content and status. Right, but then someone in the future's changed the content to be description and added a new field.
Yeah.
And suddenly the properties in your class don't line up with the data that's in the database and you get errors all over the place. So event versioning is how we will handle being able to promote the data from the old style into the new style. So
through transformation.
So what Daniel's talking about is sort of similar to the way the Stripe API works with the different versioning and it upgrades the data and downgrades the data. The only difference is what we're thinking is that you'll upgrade the data, say, using Transformer from the old event to the new event. When Verbs reads that data, if it applies a transformation, we'll probably recommit that event immediately. So then the data is then, that might be bad though. So
and the other thing that's
still ideas at the moment.
And I've actually had to talk, Daniel come to the call with me once and we went through it, like obviously in like a B2B SaaS platform, you may want to replay events just for one tenant. And I don't think that's possible at the moment because obviously if you wanted to truncate a whole table, just because one person did something
that would be interesting. You can put metadata on events, which might help with that. You could do a query filter on the events returned before you do the replay. That might be possible. That would be how I'd approach it. That would be putting tenant ID on every event. And then you're using that to then rebuild or replay just that tenant's events. Obviously you have reference to them in the database, right? So you could drop their models in particular. Or if you've got the tenant separated by database, it's really easy to dump their database and then replay their system or whatever.
In your examples, does the data that's stored in the database, is that just a JSON, like is title just JSON file? Okay. And do people use events like this for like time series analytics? Like do they store, page views and that sort of thing? Or is that sort of up to the domain and what they want?
You could do. I don't see any reason why not. I haven't seen personally, doesn't say they're not using it. There's something a guy the other day.
Accessed, downloaded X.
Yeah. I mean, you could fire an event every time a page got viewed or a PDF got downloaded or something like that. You fire all those events and then you could use that later to calculate some analytics or what have you.
Yeah, one thing we recently found from the native packages from Laravel is like a telescope.
Mhm.
It's actually kind of very helpful for debugging. You can actually see all of the events and also listeners as well,
Yep.
like all of the subscribers going through, because we have a lot of different listeners actually under the hood.
Yeah.
A lot of new starters, we can't really tell them like what's actually included once
Yeah.
this is done.
Yeah.
But yeah, with that transparency, we can easily tell new starters to say, okay, this is the works that will be performed after this event has been triggered.
Yeah.
So it's pretty good package natively.
Yeah.
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 Telescope, that's called. I think.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Make sure you turn it off in production.
I was just, uh,
Yeah, we only-
I might- So you not like that after a couple months.
Filling up like you don't know.
Yeah, it's bad. Just don't turn it on.
I'm scarred by a few things.
Yeah.
That's my
Yeah, there's another package they introduced from Laravel 11, I think. It's called a Clarity or something like that. It's actually allowing you to monitor more
Yep, I know what you're talking
but I
about.
haven't used that.
Pulse, yeah.
Pulse,
Pulse.
that's right. Yeah.
Also run that on a separate database.
Yeah.
In production
But that's a dashboard to show you like,
Well,
different things.
yeah, so it
It's
has
not-
a
it's
Redis
not
ingest,
Yeah.
which I recommend running its own server, and yeah, it's run in its own database as well.
Yeah.
What is it called?
Pulse.
Made in Brisbane. Overhead in production.
We didn't find an overhead on the Laravel side. We just found like high session, like database sessions, so concurrent connections. But yeah, I don't know if we were using the Redis ingest or not. But if we were thinking about turning it back on, we would just spin up a separate RDS and just point it at that. Because it could tell you like one of the things that we have is like customer will say, Stolty is slow, and then we'll log on and it's like it's fine. But Pulse tells you like which users are experiencing slow endpoints, for example.
Yeah.
So you can actually log in and say, cool, your account is affected because like you've got bad data or like whatever. It's quite a good package.
Yeah. So in your example, you had like a state, and then the resource, like the post, was tied to the state.
Yep.
Is that always the case? And
Not necessarily. We're just trying to simplify it for the example.
yeah, and also like you use the ID, which is, I mean,
Yes.
most of the time it's out incremented.
So where is it? This one here,
Here,
you can see at the bottom, I'm actually using a state ID
yeah.
as the ID of the eloquent model. In Verbs, we actually use snowflakes for the IDs, and we recommend keeping that ID across the system as much as possible because it's your point of reference. So like if you do state : load, you want to pass in that ID, right? Well, if you've already got a list of the eloquent models, you can get the ID off the eloquent model and then load your state using that ID. So that's sort of why we try and use those same IDs instead of using like an incrementing ID or whatever. You could use UIDs instead if you don't like snowflakes. If you use Livewire, snowflakes, and JavaScript cause a integer max overflow error. So I prefer to use UIDs personally. That's a fun little bug that's nearly impossible to discover because it just truncates the integer, and so it's just a different ID altogether and doesn't throw an error. And so all of a sudden you're referencing the wrong states or models and stuff. It's like, oh yeah, it's fun.
And then how easy it is to add verbs on an existing project, let's say, or
So, I mean, you could put events in, like as you saw into your controllers pretty easily, but it's the existing data that sort of is the main question. Like, what do you do with it? If it's a new feature with new models, just throw it straight in, right? I don't think that's a problem. But it's an existing system, like maybe you've got your posts table already exists and you want to start tracking events on them. Daniel recommends just taking a backup of your database before you start firing events. You know what data existed in the system before you started firing events. What that allows you to do is to retroactively go back and fire events as like an ingest event to say this post already existed in our system pre-events, and this is everything that was in it beforehand. It can be tricky, to be honest. It's something that is a story we'd like to sort of develop a little bit more too, of like, how can we simplify that? But yeah, like ultimately you need an ingest event, right? If you've got an post existing in the system, the event system needs to know about it, otherwise that post state's going to be empty. It doesn't have any data in it, right? So we might just have a existing post imported event, right? And it just collects all the data, all the existing posts, we iterate through the post table, fire off those events, and then all new events can then just be applied on top of them.
Is that ID pattern the recommended way of like from the package, like using the ID of the state as the ID of the model?
We recommend it, whether it's in the documentation is a different story. Yeah, I mean, that's why I say use UUIDs if you can.
Yeah,
Or snowflakes,
because
right?
like
Because
if you do
they're uniquely
ID, that'd be
identical.
a little bit weird, like having like if you have comment like table and the ID stuff like 2 or something.
Yeah, that's yeah. If you're going to do this, make sure you're using snowflakes or UUIDs.
Yeah.
Where they're uniquely.
So for you
identified.
personally, if you start any new project, you always use event sourcing with any new
That's
project.
from the start.
Yeah.
Okay, hold up. As a non-Laravel user, what is a snowflake?
Yes.
It's actually-
I'm trying to look it up.
It's
I know what a UUID is.
So Snowflake's actually a Twitter thing. Twitter generated these long IDs, which is an alternative to UUID. And the Snowflake's actually split up in parts where it distinguishes data center. It's got a time component, a few other bits and pieces. I don't really know. I remember.
It's all like,
UUID.
it's Elon's birthday.
It's pretty long.
It's a
pretty
It's
His
original
name
Twitter.
as well.
Yeah,
Twitter, not X.
yeah, Twitter, not X. We're talking about real Twitter here.
So,
Yeah, it is just a really long integer.
and it's like format, is it hyphenated? What is it?
No, it's just a straight integer. It's not
Just an
hyphenated.
integer.
And but you basically you have to split the parts up to distinguish what data center it's in or whatever. But it's sortable, right? So that's one of the benefits.
UUID is
Uh-huh.
sortable as well. UUID version 7 and the
That's
version.
right. Yeah,
Other
and
versions
that's
can
yeah.
sort
I personally prefer a sortable UUID.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Do I need BC math to work with these snowflakes? How long is this integer? Is it like
Longer
insane?
than the JavaScript's max integer.
Right. Right.
By like 2 or 3 characters or 4 digits or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Josh.
Thank you.